I'm VJ Hamilton and welcome to the Autoimmune RESET, the place for you to learn how to thrive with autoimmune disease and feel empowered to take steps to transform your health to feel better than ever. You can start making changes today to improve your health. So with every episode, my mission is to share with you simple ways to up-level your diet and lifestyle with key learnings from my own journey reversing autoimmune disease and inspirational stories from those who have reset their autoimmune symptoms and are now thriving in life. I suffered from autoimmune disease for over 25 years and now I live symptom-free, and I wish the same for you as well. So thank you for being here and sharing this time with me. Now let's get started. Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Autoimmune RESET podcast. I'm your host, VJ Hamilton. I'm a nutritionist, scientist and expert in autoimmune disease. And in today's episode, we're going to be delving into a recent study around ultra-processed foods. And I'm going to be revealing the link between ultra-processed foods and autoimmunity, because a study that was released recently by the BMJ was looking into ultra-processed food exposure and adverse health outcomes. So the study was a meta-analysis looking at 45 pooled analysis of 10 million participants, and they looked into the health impacts of ultra-processed foods. And don't worry, I am going to be explaining a bit more about ultra-processed foods as we go through this episode. There is a lot of information at the minute around ultra-processed foods. It's in the media a lot. And actually, when I reflect back into my childhood and actually into my teenage years and adulthood as well, I can see that there was certainly a link between my conditions, including alopecia areata, psoriasis and chronic fatigue syndrome, as well as joint pain and skin rashes and other symptoms that I experienced, and eating an ultra-processed food diet. I speak a lot about complexities around viruses and different food sensitivities and bacterial overgrowth that can trigger autoimmune disease. But the truth is, if you're eating a lot of ultra-processed foods, your body is more likely to be in an inflammatory state, and that can lead to autoimmunity. It's great that this is getting so much attention. I know one of the major changing points for me was when I decided to stop eating ready meals. I was eating lots and lots of ready meals when I was working as a chartered accountant. I just didn't have time to cook. It's not that I didn't like cooking. I didn't have time to cook. And when I decided to get rid of my microwave, because I was living on microwave meals, and just so I didn't have that option anymore, and I started cooking from scratch, I saw huge changes in my health and my energy as well. And I'm sure part of it related to me going from ultra-processed foods to eating a much cleaner whole food diet. And that's what we're going to be delving into today. So let's start with some of the findings in the study. So it looked at the direct association of consuming ultra-processed foods and the health outcomes. And it was looking at a variety of different conditions. And the evidence showed that there was a link between ultra-processed foods and a higher risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, anxiety, and other mental disorders. Anxiety was a symptom that I suffered with often. I would have panic attacks, but on top of that, I just was living with anxiety on a daily basis. And anxiety is going to cause you to be stressed and in that fight or flight response, which means that your body isn't prioritizing other symptoms, and that can lead to chronic illness as well. So I thought the fact that anxiety came out in this study was interesting. On top of that, they also showed that ultra-processed foods can affect your sleep, can affect your weight, and also can affect your breathing and can cause wheezing. Those were some of the key findings from the study. It showed some strong evidence linking the consumption of ultra-processed foods to adverse health outcomes. Now, I'll be honest, autoimmunity was not specifically considered in this study, which is why I want to explain how ultra-processed foods may impact you if you have an autoimmune disease or a chronic condition. So let's first talk about what ultra-processed foods are, because these are foods that have little to no whole foods. They're loaded with additives, preservatives, and unhealthy fats. And you can probably see by my description, it's not that beneficial to be eating these types of foods. I talk a lot about making sure that you are getting the most nutrients from the food you are eating. And regardless of the other health implications, if you're not eating food with lots of nutrients in it, you're going to become nutrient deficient. So let's talk about what the classes of ultra-processed foods are, because we do need to process foods to a certain extent. Fermented foods are processed, if we're looking at terminology, but we have been fermenting foods for centuries and they are extremely beneficial when it comes to being able to digest them and for our gut microbiome. So there are various foods that are processed to a certain extent that are not unhealthy, and that's why this definition of ultra processed foods is so important. So there are four main classes when it comes to processed foods. There are those minimally processed foods, which, for example, might be those that are closest to their natural state, like fresh fruits, vegetables, eggs, and meat and fish. Then we have processed culinary ingredients, and they are unprocessed foods that are used to season or cook foods, and those would be things like extra virgin olive oil or certain fats, salt, vinegar. Those types of foods are our processed culinary ingredients. Then we have processed foods, and those are foods that have undergone processing to enhance their shelf life or improve their flavour or texture to some degree. So that might include foods that have been canned or frozen, such as canned vegetables. Cheese would come into that category, and baked bread. And lastly, we have those ultra-processed foods. And ultra-processed foods are those that have been heavily processed. They typically contain lots of ingredients. When you're looking at the back of the pack of these foods, they'll have lots of ingredients listed. They have additives, preservatives, artificial flavours, all the things that we know are not beneficial to us. So, for example, you might find those in snacks, ready-to-eat meals, sugary beverages, and fast food items. And again, when I look back, I was eating a lot of fast food as a child and a teenager. I grew up in the 80s. My parents were very excited about all these convenient fast food options. They felt actually quite luxurious at the time, and we would eat them often. And I'm sure that didn't do me any good. And I did get diagnosed with an autoimmune disease at 7 years old, but it was nobody's fault. People just thought these foods were healthy, and I know there were various adverts for cereals at the time that really had that image of health around those types of foods, but the truth is they are ultra-processed foods. They don't contain many, if any, nutrients, and they also contain certain additives that are going to impact your health, and that's what the study revealed. So what foods do you need to look out for? Which foods are ultra-processed? So I'm going to go through a few different food types that are more likely to be ultra processed foods. And as I said, I didn't really know about ultra processed foods when I decided to get rid of my microwave and started cooking from scratch. It just seemed obvious to me that even though when I looked at the packaging, it was in the UK, we highlight things in a traffic light code. So there was lots of green, which means it doesn't have a lot of fat or doesn't have a lot of salt in it, but it probably doesn't have much else in it either. And it also will have had preservatives added to it to extend the shelf life. So here are some foods that are ultra processed that you are best reduced from your diet as much as possible. So we have sugar sweetened beverages, or any sweetened beverages, I would say. So that's the soft drinks, the fruit flavoured drinks, the energy drinks, even sweetened teas are ultra processed. So if you are consuming these drinks on a daily basis, you are best to reduce this as much as you can. You can start incorporating different types of drinks into your diet, like more herbal teas, or if you like soft drinks. And I used to drink soft drinks all the time. Again, as a teenager, I rarely drank water. I just drank soft drinks. We had them in our kitchen and we would just have them stacked up. And I used to just go into the kitchen and that's what I would have as a drink. which actually scares me when I think about it now. But if you are consuming those types of drinks, then what I love, because I just got so used to the fizziness, is having sparkling water, and I might put in some lemon or lime, or even flavour with blended berries, or you can flavour it with lots of different types of fruits as well. But just be conscious of the sugar. You don't want to be adding lots of tropical fruit, because that could actually still cause you an issue from a blood sugar perspective. But you can flavour water in that way. You can also flavour water with things like mint and rosemary. That's really lovely as well. But yes, these are one of the main items that I would look for when it comes to removing ultra-processed foods from your diet, because I find a lot of people are just consuming these drinks without even thinking about it. Next is sugary snacks, of course, and you might find that in sweets or chocolate or biscuits, pastries, cakes. Those types of things are ultra processed. And when I'm going through this list, you might think, oh gosh, it's all the things that I love. And it doesn't mean you have to take them out of your diet completely. Think about what you are consuming on a daily basis. You don't want to be consuming any of these things on a daily basis. Yes, you might have the odd instance where you have one of these things. That's not a problem. And you should never feel guilty about anything that you're eating. But honestly, you are best to remove these from your diet. A lot of the time, people are thinking mainly about weight, which I'll touch on in a moment. But we need to be thinking about the health outcomes and the health effects of these foods as well. And that's how I've always gone about it, because one of the things that I struggled with as a teenager and even in my 20s was actually putting on weight, because I wasn't digesting any of the nutrients I was eating. So I just felt like I could eat anything, but I was only focused on weight at that point. And the truth is, it goes much wider than that. The third one is processed meat, such as hot dogs, sausages, bacon, all the things that are part of an English fry-up, really. But you can get much better versions of these types of foods now, and you want to look for nitrate-free or those types of processed meats that haven't been cured or smoked, or haven't got any chemical preservative in them. And you can buy better versions now, but they are still processed. And there are lots of studies around processed meats and their impact on different health conditions. So you are best to minimise those as best as possible. But just be aware that there are some better quality ones around. Next is instant noodles and soups, something that I lived on when I was traveling. I would just have instant noodles all the time. It was either instant noodles or cereal. And now I wonder why I had adult acne when I was traveling and put on a lot of weight. It was actually a time where I did put on weight, and I was consuming lots of sugar in these types of foods. So instant noodles, soups and soup mixes, which seem very convenient, but they have a lot of sodium in them, a lot of artificial flavours and preservatives, and they lack those nutrients. So if you are having one of those types of soups for lunch every day, one, it's going to have chemicals in it that are harmful to your body, but on top of that, they're going to be quite low nutrient density as well. Then we have the packaged snacked foods. Oh gosh, I used to love crisps. I ate a packet of crisps every day for about 10 years. And then when I started to think about eating healthier, I realised that maybe that packet of crisps a day was not a good idea. But these categories include crisps, crackers, pretzels. There's lots of those packaged snack foods. I will still buy packaged snack foods, I'm going to be honest, but I buy foods that I feel are a little bit healthier, but at the same time, they're never going to be that healthy, and I realise that. But sometimes you just want that crunch, or you just want to enjoy a packet of crisps, or I really like my plantain crisps. So those are foods that are ultra processed. They have unhealthy fats in them. That's what a lot of my clients, when I mention to them about cutting down things like crisps, they wonder why, if it's to do with the salt. But no, it is partly to do with the unhealthy fats. There are those oxidized fats in things like crisps, which are going to cause inflammation and issues with your blood vessels. Then we have fast food and convenience meals, which I'm sure you're not surprised by. So burgers, fries, pizzas, I mean, I'll be honest, I do like all these foods, and there is going to be a time in my life where I might have a pizza. Obviously, for me, I'm going to have gluten-free, but I'm aware that I shouldn't be having this regularly. And they contain ingredients like trans fats, so those really inflammatory fats, refined carbohydrates, which are going to affect your blood sugar, and some other unhealthy additives as well. And last but not least, there are breakfast cereals and bars. And unfortunately, yes, most breakfast cereals are ultra processed. They might have on the front of them that they're natural or heart healthy or whatever they're allowed to say because of the fortified vitamins and minerals that they put into these products, or sometimes because of what they are made from. But the truth is that they have a lot of added sugar, artificial flavors and preservatives, and unfortunately they are not a great choice. And again, in my own journey, looking back, I was eating different types of very convenient breakfasts in the morning, and making that switch from these types of breakfast to a much healthier, nutrient-dense breakfast like a smoothie or a chia seed pudding, even having oats, or probably one of the best options if you are not sensitive to them is eggs with some avocado and some seeded bread or something like that, which just has so much more nutrition in it. So they're the foods that we need to be mindful of. But then I wanted to explain the difference between nitrates that are added to those processed meats and healthy nitrates, because I mentioned on an earlier podcast about the importance of nitrates for our vascular health. And they are extremely beneficial for our vascular health. So I'm just briefly going to touch on the nitrates that we consume in processed meats, which are added to bacon and sausage and ham and different deli meats, are added with a lot of preservatives. But these nitrates enhance the colour and flavour of those meats. Now, those additives can actually prevent the growth of a harmful bacteria called Clostridium, which is another reason why they add it to those foods. But when those meats are cooked at high temperatures with the nitrates in them, then they can form things called nitrosamines, and they are carcinogenic compounds associated with an increased risk in various health conditions. So it's because they contain the nitrates, but then they are heated at very high temperature, and they form nitrosamine. However, when we're consuming nitrates that are present in many whole foods like leafy greens, root vegetables, and certain fruits like celery and strawberries, these are converted to nitric acid in the body and play a crucial role in regulating your blood pressure, and they're extremely important for vascular health. So consuming nitrates in whole foods isn't a problem. It's when they're added to meat. But as I said, there are some products now which are nitrate free. So if you are going to eat anything like that, look out for the nitrate free version, because they are going to be better. One of the areas that I think people don't really consider when it comes to ultra processed food is the impact that they have on their health beyond weight. As I said, I didn't put on weight as a child or even in my 20s, other than when I went traveling, to be honest. And I didn't really think about anything I was consuming. I would have for lunch a sandwich, a pack of crisps, and I would buy a cake. And that was what I would eat every day, and it just didn't affect my weight. I remember as part of a health assessment that we had at work, they told me that my body fat was in the range of an athlete, and at the time I had severe chronic fatigue syndrome. I wasn't doing much exercise, so I knew something wasn't quite right there. But I didn't consider the fact that actually what I was eating was ultra processed, and even though I wasn't gaining weight, it was still impacting my health. So here are a few ways that ultra-processed foods can impact your health. Well, I've said about the fact that they don't contain any nutrients. So if you are trying to increase your nutrients with every meal and you're eating a lot of ultra-processed foods, then you are not going to be getting the right amount of nutrients in your daily food. and that can lead to nutrient deficiencies, which has a knock-on effect to the immune system and can cause dysfunction, and that can lead to autoimmune disease. And when I'm working with clients, they will do my cell health test, which tests for various nutrient deficiencies, some of the key ones that are important for cellular health and overall health. And 9 times out of 10, my clients are low in those nutrients. And that's partly to do with diet. Sometimes there are other factors as well. Now, many ultra-processed foods have a very high level of unhealthy fats, refined sugars, and artificial additives, and that can trigger inflammation in the body. And we know that inflammation is a factor in chronic illness and autoimmune conditions. When your body is inflamed, you're far likely to develop an autoimmune condition. So we don't want that. In addition, ultra-processed foods lack a lot of dietary fiber, which is essential for maintaining our healthy gut microbiome. So when we have a low fiber diet and we have high processed foods, that can cause imbalance in the gut and lead to something called dysbiosis. And when we have dysbiosis, that can lead to digestive issues, it can lead to inflammation, and it can also increase your risk of some of the gastrointestinal diseases. Even things like inflammatory bowel disease can be linked to this. Next is that ultra-processed foods can affect our blood sugar regulation. I've spoken a lot on the podcast about the importance of blood sugar balance, and we know because of the added sugars and refined carbohydrates in these foods that it can spike your blood sugar levels, especially when there isn't enough fiber. So it's always worth looking at the back of the packet and looking at the sugar content of the food you're eating if you are eating processed foods, because you don't really want to be eating anything that's more than 5 grams of sugar per 100 grams of product. So that is my rule of thumb when I'm looking at eating or buying something that's processed. Then we know that ultra-processed foods can have effect on our cardiovascular health. They are typically high in sodium. That's the other area that I would look for on the back of the packet, the sodium levels. And we know sodium can contribute to high blood pressure and an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And because vascular health and making sure that your circulation is optimal in various autoimmune conditions, including alopecia areata and multiple sclerosis, then we don't want to be impacting that by eating these ultra-processed foods. And lastly, it isn't really my area, but there has been shown to be a risk in relation to cancer around consuming ultra-processed foods. For example, the nitrates and nitrates which are found in those processed meats are associated with an elevated risk of certain cancers, including colorectal cancer. So what's the specific link when it comes to ultra-processed foods and autoimmune disorders? Well, as I mentioned, one of the main factors is the fact that these ultra-processed foods are going to trigger systemic inflammation, which we know is one of the main contributing factors when it comes to autoimmune disease. So if you are eating a lot of these foods on a daily basis, you are far more at risk of developing an autoimmune condition, especially if you have a predisposing genetic profile in relation to autoimmune conditions. But even if you don't, you're putting yourself more at risk of immune dysfunction, which can lead to autoimmune conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and celiac disease. Ultra-processed foods also affect your gut health, and that can lead to leaky gut syndrome. When you have leaky gut syndrome, which is increased intestinal permeability, the gaps in your gut barrier are wider than they should be, and they let lots of particles into the bloodstream, and that fires up an immune response. And that can happen when you eat a lot of ultra-processed foods, which can then lead to autoimmunity. And it's just something to be aware of if you've had autoimmune flares in the past, or you have family members with autoimmune disease. You don't want to be consuming a lot of these products because you are more at risk of developing more autoimmune diseases, or going back into a flare, or just developing your first autoimmune disease. So it's something to be aware of. Now, there is a specific link between the gums that they add to ultra-processed foods and autoimmune disease. So cross-reactivity is when the immune system will fire up and cause an inflammatory response against something that it doesn't recognize in the body. And that, for example, could be a gum that is added to some of these processed foods. And if your body and you're susceptible to having an autoimmune response to these gums. So your immune system will fire up against the gum, but then it will cross-react with some part of your body, some part of self tissue. And as a result of that, you will end up with damage to that tissue, and that will then lead to autoimmune disease, dependent on what tissue it targets. So some of the gums that are added to these processed foods are xanthan gums, guar gum, and carrageenan. These are some of the main gums that are added and are linked to autoimmune disease. And when you do the Cyrex RA10, which is looking at food reactivity, it's a food sensitivity test that I often run with my clients, and it goes into the main food items that are more likely to cause an autoimmune response. It's a really sophisticated test. It looks at IgG and IgA antibodies in the body against certain foods, but it also looks at gums, which is really important. These gums, as I said, are normally in ultra-processed foods. They add texture, stability, so it's worth looking on the back of your packets. If you're consuming something daily and it has a gum in it and you have an autoimmune disease, then it might be that you are having cross-reactivity with some of these gums. I mean, it could be many things, and that's why testing can really help, because if you know you're reacting to these gums, then you can take them out of the diet and you may find that your symptoms massively improve as a result. Now, the one specific autoimmune disease has been associated with the cross-reactivity of certain gums, and that is celiac disease. And we know celiac disease is a disease where we have destruction to the intestinal wall when we eat gluten. But what they have shown is that actually those with celiac disease may have a similar response when they consume these gums. So somebody with celiac disease might have taken gluten out of the diet and are not seeing any results. And it might be the fact that because they have then started including lots of gluten-free foods, which are full of these gums. Honestly, I'm gluten-free and I have to look very hard for the most cleanest, best products when it comes to anything processed that is gluten-free, because they add so many of these xanthan gums and guar gums and other gums to, for example, gluten-free bread. So you need to watch out for that. So if you are celiac or you have gluten sensitivity and you haven't seen results by taking gluten out of your diet, this might be something to try. As part of this discussion, I couldn't not talk about the role of microplastics, because a lot of these foods that we're consuming that are processed are wrapped in plastic, and that can leak into the foods. And there has been a recent study about how microplastics can get into the brain. So when you are consuming foods every day that are wrapped in plastic, or you're drinking drinks that are in plastic bottles, what can happen over time is we can end up with a lot of these microplastics in the body, and they can cause cellular dysfunction, and they can cause other issues in the body, because your body doesn't really want to have plastics in it. It's not going to function optimally when it does. So it's definitely worth considering the amount of foods that you are consuming that are wrapped in plastic, and where you can buy foods that aren't in plastic. If you have kind of a local grocery shop, or you can now order these organic vegetable boxes, they are going to be better than consuming lots of foods that have plastics. And it's normally around processed foods. And I could probably do a whole other podcast episode about this. It was one of the studies that I asked if anybody wanted me to talk about on today's podcast, and most people wanted to talk about ultra processed foods, but we need to be aware of microplastics. It's going to be a topic which is going to gain more momentum, and I'm sure you're going to hear loads more about it, because studies are focusing on this and the impact of human health. So where you can, if you are able to, when you're buying any foods, try to buy those foods that are not in plastic. If you're looking at buying drinks, go for glass bottles. The more you can make your food yourself, the better it's going to be, because you can avoid plastic completely if you're making the food yourself, and you can store it in glass containers. When I was making some quite significant shifts in my health, I decided to slowly start replacing my plastic Tupperware with glass storage bottles and bowls as well. And over time, I have now got a kitchen full of mostly glass. Even my baking trays are glass, and I actually much prefer the glass baking trays because things don't seem to stick as much. So I've told you all this scary stuff, and I hope I haven't scared you today. I'm telling you this information because I want you to feel empowered. There is things you can do. It does take a little bit more thought, and I realised that there's cost associated with this as well, and ultra processed foods are cheaper. Just have this information in mind when you are making choices around the food that you're purchasing and the food that you are eating. But there are some things that you can do to protect yourself. If you feel that you are eating too much ultra processed foods at the minute and you would like to make the shift, here are a few ways that you can do that. So firstly, I would gradually replace things. As I said with my plastic storage boxes, I replaced them slowly. I didn't try and do everything at once. So if you are consuming something that's ultra processed quite regularly, then start by replacing it with something that is minimally processed, so a whole food. So take one thing at a time and start substituting it for something else. This can help with blood sugar issues as well. If you are looking to decrease sugar in your diet, you can choose one thing after this podcast. Choose one thing that you're going to replace, and instead of consuming that food or drink, bring in some healthy food instead, like some fresh fruit or vegetables, nuts. You can make homemade snacks as well. And I suppose if you're making something processed, for example, you're making some flaxseed crackers, that is going to be far less of an issue because you're not adding all those additives. So that's not in the ultra processed food category, as long as you're not adding all these different additives and preservatives to it, which I'm sure you wouldn't be. So you can make snacks yourself as well. Next is to start meal planning and preparing. That's what helped me at the beginning when I've had such a full-on week and I knew that I needed convenient options. I spent a couple of hours on a Sunday, I put a podcast on or some music on, and I spent 2 hours meal planning and preparing. And I really enjoyed that time. It helped with my stress levels as well. And I just made various different dishes so I'd have them as convenient options in the fridge, and just made sure that on a lunchtime when I was in a rush that I didn't go and buy lots of ultra processed foods. I just ate the food that I had. So if you aren't doing any batch cooking at the moment, I really recommend that. There's some books that you can buy to kind of guide you through the batch cooking process, but I think it is good to have a couple of hours where you spend time batch cooking for the week ahead. If you don't want to do that, you can also just make sure that you make enough food on an evening and then you can have that for lunch the next day. That's also a good way to do it. Also, it's vital that you look on labels of foods. If you've got some ultra processed foods in your cupboards at the moment, go have a look at the labels and just read through them. Look at the number of ingredients. You don't want many ingredients in a food. I mean, 5 is the absolute max, and they should be foods that you recognize. And also you're hoping that there isn't much added sugar or unhealthy fats. Look for artificial flavors, look at the sugar content, look at the sodium content. Those are things that are worth reviewing before you eat something, and it might put you off. I've started looking at labels even when I'm on a plane and I'll get my gluten-free meal, and they're very accommodating and I always get some gluten-free food, but when I look at the back of some of the food that they give me, I honestly am shocked at the amount of sugar that there are in some of these products. So have a look, you might be surprised. I mean, this is probably more of an obvious recommendation, but focus on consuming whole foods like I did when I first started out. I knew that I couldn't have microwave meals anymore. I needed an alternative, and I just started baking salmon. That was a really easy one for me because it would only take, I'd fry it a little bit on the hob and then I'd put it in the oven for 15 minutes. I'd put some vegetables with that, like some broccoli or some cauliflower. And that was just a really lovely meal, and it was an easy meal to have, and it was a healthy meal. So baking is a really nice way to start eating whole foods, and it doesn't take much time. You just chop up some vegetables, you put the salmon in the oven with the vegetables, and you're done in 15 minutes. So that's something that I found was very easy to start with. Obviously, I experiment more now, and if you have done that meal prep, you might have some healthy grains in the fridge or some legumes that you can add to that. And just make it easy and convenient for yourself, especially if you have quite a demanding life and you're thinking, wow, what am I going to do without these convenient food options? There are ways that you can manage this. Do what's enjoyable to you as well. And then lastly is mindful eating. When you start paying attention to how hungry you are or how full you feel or the food that you're eating and what it tastes like, it can really change the way that you eat. I do intermittent fasting, and I've been asked the question of what kind of fasting regimen do I stick to, and the truth is I don't stick to any. It's changes on a daily basis. I will eat when I start to feel hungry. I certainly won't put my body under any stress. But if I'm not hungry and I can be productive in the morning, then I might not eat until about 2 p.m. sometimes. I'm listening to my body. And then when I do eat, because I know I need to get lots of nutrients from the food if I haven't eaten for half the day, I'm really focused on making sure I'm getting the most from that meal. And I sit down at a table, I move away from my desk, sit down at the table and eat my lunch without any distraction, or eat my dinner without distraction, and just making sure that I am thinking about the food that I'm eating, the taste, the flavour. I'm chewing my food. I'm not always best at chewing food 30 times. I need to keep reminding myself of that even now. So that's definitely something I can work on. But chewing your food 30 times is going to help with that digestion process as well. And it may, in the end, reduce your craving for ultra-processed foods, because I know when I start feeling hungry after fasting, I'll think, I'll just have some seaweed crackers or whatever I've got in my cupboard. And I just think, actually, is that the right thing for me to be eating after a long fast? I want to eat something nutrient dense. And then I will reflect, take 2 minutes, and then I'll start making something really healthy, or I'll grab something from my fridge that I might have made in advance. So there are various ways that you can manage this. And if you need any further tips about how to reduce ultra-processed foods from your diet, feel free to send me a direct message on Instagram. My Instagram is @the Autoimmunity Nutritionist. You can also join my free group, the Autoimmune Forum. I share recipes regularly on there, not always mine, but I'm sharing healthy recipes that I recommend that are anti-inflammatory and nutrient dense, and all cooking from scratch. They're ultra processed food free. So you can join my forum. You can go through all the threads that have been there along the years and see the different recipes that you can start trying. And a smoothie is a great one because that's just full of whole foods, and it's a really easy way to just pack in a lot of nutrition in one meal. So if you haven't started getting into smoothies, it's, spring, summertime, it's a lovely time to start incorporating them into your diet. Also, if you weren't part of Nutrition Essentials for Healthy Hair Growth, which I hosted this week, and you would like to watch the recording of that, then I'm going to put the link to that in the show notes. So we talked about a lot of different foods and nutrients which are important for hair growth, but also looked at the underlying root causes of hair loss. And it's good to kind of go through that and understand what might be a factor for you so that you can address that, and that can help with healthy hair growth in the future. So I'll put the link for that in the show notes, and have a great rest of your week, and I will speak to you soon. Take care. Thank you very much for joining me today on the Autoimmune Reset. I really hope you enjoyed the discussion, and be sure to subscribe to the podcast so that you never miss an episode. And if you liked it, I would hugely appreciate a review on iTunes, as it helps me understand what you like about the podcast and to help share the information with more people. I'm excited to speak to you next time, and remember, you have the power to take the reins on your health. So keep the faith and celebrate the small wins. Until next time.